Hey everyone, it's Naomi Wolf with the Geneva Bible, the 1560 Geneva Bible, the Chabad Bible in Hebrew compared with the Revised Standard Version. We're reading through the whole thing. We're at Numbers 30. Yes, I took a couple of days off, which I probably shouldn't have, but it was the first day of Passover last night. So Chag Sameach, which means Chag is holiday, Sameach is happy. Happy holiday, or you can say Chag Pesach Sameach. Pesach is Hebrew for Passover. And it is last night was the first night. Of course, Jewish holidays generally start the evening before, sundown before and then extend the following day, and then end at sundown again the following day if it's just a one-day holiday, which is true of the first night of Passover. And we had a Seder, and I won't name our host, one of my personal heroes, but as important, it was very, very interesting to see how someone who really put his career and reputation on the line to protect the human species during COVID, and for the truth, just this passionate, commitment to the truth. And I've got to credit his wife and his kids who didn't, stand in the way and who no doubt supported him in doing that. You can see this direct line. I'm not saying there were no other influences on, our host last night in his taking such a heroic stand for liberty. However, you can really see in the reading of the Passover Seder, which we're enjoined to do, and you remember just in the last couple of chapters, interestingly, the how to celebrate Pesach in addition to Shavuot and Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, are all spelled out. But you can really see the direct line from 3,500 years ago. We were slaves in Egypt. 3,200 years ago, that's the period when the 12 tribes are originating in the desert. Right till last night, this direct line. And I don't know, maybe Hindu practices go back that far, but I don't know of another civilization that has continuous practices. Maybe Zoroastrianism, I'll have to check. But it literally, what we were doing last night is literally what you heard a couple of chapters ago. For the second or third time, by the way, in this story, God instructed us to do. You were slaves in Egypt. And the phrasing is always very similar. You were slaves in Egypt. They were mistreating you. They were abusing you. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. I brought you out of the house of slavery. And Yeshua, what a slip. And God, Yahweh, always says, with a mighty hand and a strong forearm, Zroa chazaka, yad chazak, and an outstretched forearm. And he also says last night, in the excerpts that were put together by the rabbis, who are compiling the Talmud and arguing about the Torah, going all the way back to the Babylonian exile, he says, for emphasis, it was I who brought you out. It was I who did these miracles. It was I who slew the firstborn children of the Egyptians. Not an angel, not a messenger, not an emissary. It was I, God. I did it. I did that for you guys. So don't forget. And le dor vador is the phrase, from generation to generation, literally to generation to generation. Dor is a generation. You need to tell this story to your children so that they remember that we were slaves in Egypt. And the other really interesting thing about the Passover Seder, many interesting things, we talked about it last Passover, and I think maybe the Passover before, because we've been doing this for over 2 years, you guys, as I recall. But, there's this symbolic plate, and it's the Passover platter. Seder means order, literally. So it's a meal that is done in order, right? There's prayers and blessings and, pouring of wine, 4 cups of wine. You quote the rabbis, you recapitulate some of the analysis of the story of the Exodus from Egypt from the rabbinical tradition, and then you get to the meal. And, children everywhere, all over the world, have very vivid memories of kind of waiting for, hours to get through the preliminary parts of the Seder and then to get to the meal. And then the most fun part for kids is, of course, pardon me, the 4 questions, which is a way to engage children and keep them alert, and also, like, I think culturally habituate them to Torah, Torah analysis and Talmudic analysis. It's 4 questions about kind of how to approach the learning, the lesson from the meal and the celebration that we're having. And children, the youngest person at the table, is supposed to ask the question. So children ask, and that engages them. And also there's a hiding of the afikomen, which is a piece of matzah that the head of the household breaks off, and then sneakily, you can never catch them doing this, usually he, the head of the household, hides it when people aren't looking or when they're distracted, and then the kids get to go on a hunt after the meal to find the afikomen and then to ransom it back, and you can't carry on and finish the Seder until the afikomen is ransomed back. So what is that piece of folk tradition? I'm not really sure. Definitely, again, it's a way to keep the kids engaged and to keep them alert, right? It's really fun to tear through a stranger's house when you're 7, looking for the hidden afikomen. And very often it's been on a bookcase, like in the pages of a book or on top of a book. So that's really interesting. It definitely sharpens your alertness as a child. And then ransoming it back, an early lesson in negotiation. I have no idea where that came from. I'll look. But I guess I am kind of thinking about, what does it mean to be raised Jewish culturally? And why are people so mad at us, of course? But these 3 ways of engaging children in what is otherwise a very long, can be dry, religious ritual, which is very, very important, right, for the formation of their sense of identity and their relationship to God. Like, God literally says again and again, tell your kids that I took you out of Egypt, that you were slaves in Egypt. Don't forget, from generation to generation, tell them you were slaves in Egypt. Well, I do think that, in these little ways and big ways, children raised within the, Jewish traditions, especially the more observant Jewish traditions, are raised to have a voice very young and be part of the incredibly sacred work of analyzing a text, debating or discussing, what does this mean? What does this text mean? That's not, as I've said so many times, that's not considered rebellious or disrespectful in Jewish practice. It's literally the heart of what you're supposed to do every day, all day long, especially if you're male. If you're female, as the rabbis explain, you're welcome to, but you don't have to, because the assumption is that you are closer to God anyway, because you're closer to the source of life. You could argue that, but anyway, women are not forbidden from studying the Torah. It's just not a mitzvah the way it is with men. But this starts out very, very young, and also even the negotiation. To me, it's really kind of a little exercise in free will. It does give kids a sense of power. I have something the grown-ups need, but also it's an exercise in fairness and conflict resolution and reaching a win-win outcome. Everybody kind of has a little exercise in, I'll give you $5. I want 8. No. Okay, fine. Let's settle for 7, and you might, I guess feeds into the stereotype of Jews as money hungry or all about business. I really have a different view of it. I think that it was very important for us to survive in very hostile environments. I mean, I'm really just riffing on this, like, why do we do it? But it does make sense. I've thought a lot about Jews and conflict, right? And how freaked out the whole world becomes when Jews fight back, right? Physically fight back. And, we really haven't been allowed to for, since the destruction of Judea in 70 AD, until 1948, of course, when we had our own country again, or Israel was a country with an army. But, and I'm not taking a position on what should be done in the Middle East. I want a two-state solution. I want peace and so on. But I do think that to survive for 2,000 years in one incredibly hostile environment after another does take the ability to not function from your prefrontal cortex. I'm sorry, to not function from your amygdala, not to get in a bar fight or, kill the Cossack down the road because he threatened your family. You have to use your shrewdness to survive, honestly, and whatever your impulses are. Like, remember, Moses killed an Egyptian slave driver who was oppressing a Hebrew slave, and then he had to get out of town. It didn't work out well. So we haven't been for 2,000 years in environments in which violence is even an option, even in self-defense. So I do think survival, or if God forbid, a Jew in the Tsar's Russia, violently resisted having his son conscripted against his will into the army, which happened all the time, and was a big driver of immigration to the West. That would go very badly. The whole village would be torched. The whole village would be massacred. All the possessions plundered, the animals taken or murdered. I mean, horrific massacres, pogroms over and over and over and over. So Jews really had to, from a very young age, learn to not be overcome by their animal impulses, just to survive in those environments. And so to me, giving a child at quite a young age an incentive to stay cool, engage in an adversarial conversation, but bring it to a win-win outcome. And not go to, I'm never giving this to you, too bad, or I'm giving it away for free, right? I think that it did train kids very young in managing themselves in very hostile environments and looking for win-win solutions, even with people who wanted to kill them, right? So that's my riff on that. But it did, I will say, as someone who grew up going to Seders, even though we were not Orthodox, it does really imprint you that year after year after year, in the springtime, when you could just be planting your garden or, going for a bike ride, you do take time with your family to really think about the fact that we haven't always been free. We were the lowest of the low. We didn't have free will. 400 years, we didn't have a choice. We were doing hard work. Our lives were made bitter. That the evocation of slavery is so intense and profound in the Seder and in the commentary on the Seder. You really can feel that generation after generation, Jewish parents did keep that memory alive of, we haven't always had a country. We haven't always had the temple. We were slaves in Egypt. We weren't free to even manage our own labor or enjoy the fruits of our own labor. We were doing hard work. And even some of the symbols on the Seder plate speak to this. There's bitter herbs. It was endive last night, but it's often horseradish is traditional. And there's also, and that represents the cruelty of slavery. There's salt water, and that represents the tears that the slaves shed. And you dip the bitter herbs in the salt water to reinforce, to remember, like viscerally with your body and with your, taste buds, the taste of slavery. It was so bitter. We wept. And then there's sweetness, right? And charoset, it represents the mortar that held the pyramids together, the construction works in Egypt that the Jewish slaves were building, the Hebrew slaves. Jewish wasn't a word at that time. But that is made of dates and honey and nuts. And then at a certain point, you're encouraged to make a kind of sandwich out of a little bit of matzah, 2 pieces of matzah, and sweetness and bitterness, and it's to, you know, taste or experience the sweetness of freedom and remember the bitterness of slavery at the same time. And, you know, my Irish husband understandably said, why don't you guys just celebrate being free? And, you know, I just had this instinctive reaction to that, which is we're Jewish. We can't, we have to remember the bitterness. We have to remember the bitterness as well, so that it'll bother us if anyone is not free. And so we'll be vigilant. And I don't think it's an accident that a lot of the people, I've thought about this, a lot of the people who were out front as freedom fighters during lockdowns, which was a straight up enslavement exercise, you know, and forced injections, a lot of them came from genocided or enslaved backgrounds and ancestries. There were African American or Caribbean American, you know, descendants of people who'd been enslaved from Africa. There's an Armenian. They were genocided. There are a lot of Irish people, if you think about it, descendants of the Irish. They were genocided and starved off their land, and treated as second-class citizens when they came to this country, and enslaved actually in this country. Lots of Jews, you know, and I just don't think it's coincidental that a really disproportionate number of freedom fighters come from ancestral memories of having been enslaved or genocided. They recognize the signs. Let's see. So Slavika, hello, Slavika, says, when the Israelites prayed to God for deliverance from oppressive enemies, the biblical narrative shows that God consistently heard their cries, felt compassion for their suffering, and acted decisively to save them. But that is no longer true. Well, I mean, interesting. You could certainly make the case that historically, for the last 2,000 years, things have really been terrible for us, and God did not hear our cries. However, you know, something pretty profound changed in 1948. You know, we like every year we say next year in Jerusalem at the Seder. Every year. We never forgot Jerusalem. And I'm not making a political point here. I'm just stating an historical and religious fact. We never kind of forgot about it and just thought, okay, well, here we are in, you know, Siberia or, you know, Argentina. We'll just forget about Zion. We never forgot, right? And we're not supposed to forget. Like our text says, don't forget. You know, it also, the text says you're going to be gathered back in. It does say that. We've talked about that. So that really did happen. And I guess I would also say, you know, look at what's happening in the world right now. And I don't want to get ahead of events, God forbid, but, you know, a crazy rogue regime working on nuclear warheads that could take out human civilization is is being bombarded by an alliance of this tiny country of, very hated people historically, and the world's greatest superpower, allies, right? And, you know, this rogue regime is dumping missiles on Israel, and everything's pretty much okay. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary. It doesn't look like normal warfare, I have to say. I'm not going to get spookier than that, but it does kind of feel like, you know, events are unfolding, you know, in some metaphysical way that I don't want to get ahead of, right? Because God forbid it could all fall apart. And I guess the last thing I would say, Slavika, is, you know, you could look at any 2,000-year period of human history, including the Roman Catholic Church, and say God's favor wasn't consistently with those people. Or the Church of England, you know, the Protestant Reformation, the Quakers, you know, the Huguenots. I mean, every religion has had persecution and setbacks and difficulties. And so I guess what I would say to you gently in pushback is, what does it mean to have God hear your cries? I don't think it means you always get exactly what you want. I don't think it means you never get defeated. I think it means God hears your cries. And And certainly in this story in the Hebrew Bible, this is happening over and over. Like the people ask for something from God and they don't always get it the way they ask for it, right? Because often God has other plans than their own plans. They don't even get to, the menu they want in the desert. uh they were literally crying for the flesh pots of Egypt, and God's like, nope, you're gonna have manna, and you're gonna have manna again, and you're gonna have manna again. I'm not taking you back to slavery, even though the food was better. Right? So I think that we should bear that in mind. We don't know what it means for God to hear our cries every minute, because God's making it clear in this story anyway that his definition of responding to us for our own good in the larger plan is not always aligned with our limited vision of how good that food tasted when we were slaves in Egypt. Um, let's see now. James Green. Is it true that Israeli bulldozers deliberately dig up the cemeteries of Palestinians in Gaza and prohibit displays of grief and mourning by the subject population? Well, James, I've never heard of that. It's definitely against the rules of war that uh, the IDF is supposed to abide by. Um, I do know, not to engage in whataboutery, that Jewish cemeteries are routinely desecrated all over the Arab world. Most Arab countries used to have big Jewish populations that were kicked out in the 40s and 50s, and cemeteries are desecrated. But if you've got a good source for that, let's see it. Obviously, it shouldn't happen. I've never heard of it. I just want to remind everyone, Palestine's in charge of Gaza now. Gaza is in charge of Gaza. And, you know, the Palestinian Authority is in charge of the West Bank. Um, I'm not saying bad things don't happen. I'm saying there is a ceasefire, and what is happening in Gaza now is under the oversight of the Gazans, and what's happening in the West Bank is under the oversight of the Palestinians. But bring me your source. I'm happy to call out any bad behavior. I just think we should be consistent and call it out on both sides. All right, let's get to the text, you guys. Thank you for your wonderful questions. I appreciate you being here because I know there's so much anti-Semitism in the interwebs these days, and I appreciate you wanting to know what the real truth is about the things you're being shown. So I'm having a little bit of trouble sharing my screen. Darling, would you would you help me, sweetheart? I can't see. Okay, share screen. Never mind. I think I got it. I got it. Nope, nope. Oh my gosh, you guys, I'm open on Safari and not on.
So grab the URL from Chrome.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to sign off and sign back on. I do, baby, because um how your browser has blocked your screen. I'm trying to share my screen, but it turns. Where's Sean? Sean is in production. Sean, are you there? Can you text him, honey? He'll help me out. But I may have to sign off and sign back on in Chrome because I cannot share my screen with you guys. That's so sad. Yeah, you know what? I'm going to come right back in Chrome. So give me 4 minutes and you'll see me again. Okay. All right. Are you guys with me? Yes, you are. So I don't know the answer to that, James Green, but as always, bring me a source and I will take a look at it. Let's see now. One more question. What is a myth? Okay, well, I can't even relate to that question. I'm sorry. So let's just go right ahead. It's been a long intro, but I've now figured out how to share my screen. And let's start with the Geneva Bible and that beautiful Elizabethan text. Here we go. Numbers 30. And again, you can follow along. You don't even have to buy the book. You can follow along on archive.org. Chapter 30. Again, the subheadline is not original. It's the commentators concerning vows, the vow of the maid, of the wife, of the widow, or divorced. So this is about the vows of women. Then Moshe spoke unto the children of Israel according to all that the Lord had commanded him. Moshe also spoke unto the heads of the tribes concerning the children of Israel, saying, This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Whosoever vows a vow unto the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a bond, that is to commit himself to an outcome, he shall not break his promise, but shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. If a woman also vow a vow unto the Lord and bind herself by a bond, being in her father's house in the time of her youth, and her father hear her vow and bond wherewith she has bound herself, and her father hold his peace concerning her, then all her vows shall stand, and every bond wherewith she has bound herself shall stand. But if her father disallow her the same day that he hears all her vows and bonds wherewith she has bound herself, they shall not be of value, and the Lord will forgive her because her father disallowed her. And the note says, by not approving or consenting to her vow. And if she has a husband, when she vows or pronounces anything with her lips wherewith she binds herself, if her husband heard it and holds his peace, meaning stays quiet concerning her, the same day he hears it, then her vow shall stand, and her bonds wherewith she binds herself shall stand in effect. But if her husband disallow her the same day that he hears it, then shall he make her vow which she has made, and that she has pronounced with her lips, wherewith she bound herself, of none effect, and the Lord will forgive her. But every vow of a widow and of her that is divorced, wherewith she has bound herself, shall stand in effect with her. And if she vowed in her husband's house or bound herself strictly with an oath, and her husband has heard it and held his peace concerning her, not disallowing her, then all her vows shall stand, and every bond wherewith she bound herself shall stand in effect. And the note says, for she is in subjection of her husband and can perform nothing without his consent. But if her husband disannul, then all her vows shall stand, and every bond wherewith she bound herself shall stand in effect. But if her husband disannulled them the same day that he heard them, nothing that proceeds out of her lips concerning her vows or concerning her bonds shall stand in effect, for her husband has disannulled them, and the Lord will forgive her. So every vow and every oath or bond made to humble the soul, her husband may establish it, or her husband may break it. And the note says to mortify herself by abstinence or other bodily exercises. But if her husband hold his peace concerning her from day to day, then he establishes all her vows, enforces or supports all her vows and all her bonds which she has made. He has confirmed them because he held his peace concerning her the same day that he heard them. But if he break them after that he has heard them, then shall he bear her iniquity. And the note says, not the same day he heard them, but some day after. These are the ordinances which the Lord commanded Moshe between a man and his wife, and between the father and his daughter, being young in her father's house. And of course, at that time, being young in her father's house meant that she was unmarried. She's still, women didn't live on their own at that time. They went straight from their father's home to their husband's home. And so that is the 1560 Geneva Bible. And I guess what I would call your attention to is this is 3,200 years ago. And it was not until the 1880s that in Britain that women had property rights in their own right. Married women had property rights. And so this is, and there were very restricted rights all the way along, in Greece and in Rome and in Europe in the Dark Ages and in Europe in the Middle Ages and in Europe in the Renaissance, right up until the 18th century, when in some places women began to have legal rights. The Napoleonic codes at the end of the 18th century, do give women some legal rights. They also gave gay people legal rights, which is interesting, gay men. But women really, had some inheritance rights and legal rights in colonial America, but there were restrictions on them. And as you know from the witch trials, just because a widow had property didn't mean that men weren't constantly scheming in colonial America to disgorge her property or lay claim to it through the courts. It's actually the subject of Nathaniel Hawthorne's House of the Seven Gables, and also the subject of the Salem witch trials. A lot of those women had property, and they were accused of witchcraft so that, other people who were male could get their hands on their property. So women's claim was fragile to property. And this is a very early feminist text, right? Before other societies, to my knowledge, gave women property rights or even rights over their own bodies. And what's so interesting about the way this chapter is worded, to me, especially as a feminist, is that it's not just about if a woman in her husband's house or her father's house makes a promise to give a sheep that she inherited, as a sacrifice, or to, sell a sheep and give the money to someone else, right? Or donate it to charity. It's not just about her disposing of her possessions. It also gives women the right to dispose of their bodies. And that interpretation is right there in the notes of these Geneva Bible translators. They say if she inflicts a vow of abstinence or exercises abstinence, they're literally saying it's not great, it's not ideal, but if a woman wants to not have sex with her husband for a while because she's involved in a religious purification period, she has the right to do that. She has the right to make that vow. Now, this chapter puts limitations on it. The husband has to consent, and the father has to consent if she doesn't have a husband. But there are limitations on his power too, the patriarchal power. They have to consent or not consent in a narrow window of the same day she makes the vow. And if they don't, then too bad. She's made the vow, and she has the right to make a vow. So that's really interesting. I mean, a man's word is his bond. The oath, swearing an oath, is a very big deal in the ancient world. Think about it. There really wasn't paper, like I'm reading a history of the Roman Empire right up until through the first, second, third century CE. People had to write on broken pieces of pottery or on flat clay tablets that were covered with wax, and then they would scratch the letters into the wax, right? Or, sometimes if the climate was dry enough and there were plants that were appropriate for it, like in Egypt, they would write on papyruses or make kind of paper-like parchment out of papyrus. But, these people are wandering around with their sheep and goats in the desert, with the wilderness of Sin, the wilderness of, the Moabites, right, on the edge of the Negev, like what's now sort of central and southern Jordan. And I've been there. It's very dry and bleak. There's nothing growing there. There's no papyrus. There's no, wax. There are no honeybees. There's no, there's barely clay, right, to make clay tablets to write on. There's plants to make ink out of, don't exist, or very hard to find. It's desert, it's wilderness. So in that condition, you've got to imagine that men and now women had to be able to say, I will give you this sheep for 20 sesterces, or 20 shekels. And their word was their bond, right? Or else things would be absolute chaos and there would be conflict everywhere. People had to take swearing very seriously. They had to take oaths very seriously. Oaths were the lifeblood of social life and business, commerce, and also religious practice, right? There's a lot of oath taking in religious practice, even if you're just taking an oath to give your child, this comes later, but give your child up to service to help the priest, or if you're taking an oath of poverty or oath of chastity. Well, poverty doesn't exist yet, but we've seen oaths of chastity, for example, for a period of time, not forever. Well, those are very serious commitments, and they signal kind of a civil adult, right, with the ability to make conditions with his resources and time and body. Well, now this chapter includes women in that. This chapter gives women the right, certain restricted rights, to say, I am going to, donate the sale of this sheep to the temple in thanks for my having a healthy baby. And, Brian has 24 hours to say, we can't afford that, honey. You can't give the money for the sheep you sold to the temple. You've got to, we've got to repair the roof. He's got 24 hours to do that. I'm kind of hoping he doesn't overhear this. And if he misses that window, I have to be as good as my word. I have to give the person I vowed to the thing that I vowed or that I promised. And if it's a bond of myself, I have the right to give that. And what's very, very interesting about this, and it's not much elucidated, right? It's pretty bare bones, is does it include oneself, like in marriage? For instance, it does give some time and attention to unmarried women in their father's homes, and that they can make vows. And presumably, the most important thing an unmarried woman could do at that time was get married, and ideally get married to the right husband to have a productive, healthy, happy marriage and family with lots of children. So does this mean that young women had 24 hours to choose a husband? In other words, I don't like that, guy twice my age who's kind of unattractive that you guys want to set me up with because he has a giant flock of, goats. I like, Yaakov over here, who's my age and handsome and makes me laugh. But he has 3 goats. Okay, I'm going to commit myself to Yaakov. Dad, you've got 24 hours to go against my wishes, but now they're my wishes. It really gives young women power within the family to some extent that young women literally didn't have in the ancient world at this time, at all, in terms of disposing of themselves as wives. So it is definitely early feminism. So let's take a look now at the Hebrew. I'm not going to go through the Hebrew in detail. Sorry, I need to open that. There we go. Because this is a pretty technical chapter, but let's see if anything leaps out. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or makes an oath to prohibit himself, he shall not violate his word. So it really stresses how important, being true to your word is. Now, this is where women come in for the first time in this chapter. Ve'isha ki tidor, and a woman who makes a vow, neder l'Adonai, to the Lord, tidor neder, who vows a vow to the Lord. Ve'asra isar, again, that repetition, or imposes a prohibition. Asur means forbidden. So she forbids a forbiddenness. Bevet aviha, in the house of her father, bin ureha, in her youth. A ne'ara is like a teenager, a youth, a female youth. Veshama aviha, and heard her father, et nidra, her vow, ve'esara, and prohibition, asher asra, which she prohibited, al nafsha, on her spirit, literally, ve'cherishla, and aviha, and remained silent, her father, ve'kamu kol nadreha, and they will stand, literally rise up, all of her vows, v'chol isar asher asra, and all her prohibitions that she has prohibited, al nafsha yakum, on herself will stand. So this translation is very interesting because in the Hebrew, it's much more of an implication of sexual boundaries. In other words, she's forbidden a forbiddenness on her spirit. To me, this reads as, she's said, I'm not going to marry him. That's how it sounds to me. She's prohibited. She's put a prohibition on her spirit or her soul. And you remember that nefesh means spirit or soul. It also means being, like a person, right? So it's got that implication, not just of the spirit, but of herself, right? And this notion that a young woman has a self is a completely new philosophical concept. Ve'im heni aviha, but if her father hinders it, ota, her, biyom sham'o, in the day that he heard, kol nidreha, all her vows, ve'esareha, and all her prohibitions, asher asra, which she prohibited, al nafsha, on her spirit, lo yakum lo yakum ve'yava yislachla, that she's imposed on herself shall not stand. Ki hinia vihaota, because her father has hindered her. But here's the sexual component. Ve'im hayu tehye, but if she is betrothed, if she is to be leish, to a man, u nedareha aleha, with her vows upon her, o mifta sfateha, or by a promise with her lips, asher asra al nafsha, which she has, again, that word asur, which is forbidden upon herself, in context imposed upon herself. Veshama isha beyom sham'o, and he heard her man, literally her husband, in the day that he heard, vehecherishla, and he's silent to her, vekamu nidreha, then they'll stand, her vows, ve'esareha, and her prohibitions, asher asra al nafsha yakumu, which she has prohibited upon herself, they will stand. And again, but if he hinders her, he's revoked the vow, and the Lord will forgive her. Ve'Adonai yislachla, specifically he's saying if the husband doesn't let her fulfill her vow, God will forgive her. The neder almana, and the vow of a widow, ugrusha, and of a divorced woman, kol asher asra al nafsha, everything that she forbade or prohibited on her spirit, yakum aleha, will stand upon her, literally will remain on her. Ve'im beit isha nidra, but if in the house of her man, meaning this woman has a husband, she swore, o asra isar, or she prohibited, a prohibition al nafsha, on her spirit, be shvu'ah, by swearing, veshama isha, and her husband heard it, vecherish la, and remained silent to her, lo hini ota, and did not hinder her, vikamu kol nidareha, then they will stand or rise up all her vows, v'chol isar asher asra, and every prohibition that she prohibited, al nafsha yakum, on her spirit shall stand. So in the Hebrew, I think that this, like, she's prohibited prohibitions on her person and they will stand, is much more authoritative and powerful, an attribution of the right of women to decide what happens to their bodies and their spirits. And again, there are restrictions, but those are very strong words. Asur is forbidden. Like when God forbids something, to humans, the Torah uses that word asur, forbidden. It's a strong word. It's not a messing around word. It's forbidden. So she's forbidding forbiddenness on her person, on her spirit. And that's very, very, very powerful. So let's see what quickly, because we are running out of time. My goodness, it goes so fast. What the Revised Standard Version, which I inadvertently closed, Numbers 30, what that has to say. So this is like literally establishing that women have the right to decide what commitments they make with themselves. And the words are as clear as they can be. Asur, the prohibition on herself. All right. I'm putting a prohibition on myself. And it seems to extend to promises made. Like to me, it says she gets to choose who she's going to marry. Limited choice, limited time period. But these are the conditions in which she can do it. So here's the RSV, vows made by women. Again, they just put that there. It's not in the original. Moses said to the heads of the tribes of the people of Israel, this is what the Lord has commanded. When a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. That's correct. Or when a woman vows a vow to the Lord and binds herself by a pledge, while within her father's house in her youth, and her father hears of her vow and of her pledge by which she has bound herself and says nothing to her, then all her vows shall stand, and every pledge by which she has bound herself shall stand. So I will just say in the Hebrew, it is much more about prohibition, that she has the right to limit what happens to her, not just to make a commitment positively. So in the Hebrew, it says her limitations, her restrictions that she set on herself will be honored. And in the Revised Standard Version, they've changed that to whatever she promises, she has to stick to it. But if her father expresses disapproval to her on the day that he hears of it, no vow of hers, no pledge by which she has bound herself shall stand, and the Lord will forgive her because her father opposed her. So I don't think in the Hebrew it says expresses disapproval. Let's take a look. Geneva Bible 1560 PDF. What does the Hebrew actually say? I'm sorry. We have the Geneva Bible. I mean the Chabad Bible. I feel like the translation has put the dad's disapproval in there as a prohibition, and it just doesn't exist. No, that's not what it says. Oh, God, honestly, these people drive me crazy. Let me show you what it says. I'm going to remove that, and I will show you what it says in the Hebrew. Bamidbar. It doesn't say what the Revised Standard Version says. All right, so again, RSV says, line 4, and her Okay, line 3. Or when a woman vows a vow to the Lord and binds herself by a pledge while within her father's house in her youth, and her father hears of her vow and of her pledge by which she's bound herself and says nothing to her, then all her vows shall stand, and every pledge by which she's bound herself shall stand. But if her father expresses disapproval to her on the day that he hears of it, no vow of hers, no pledge by which she's bound herself shall stand, and the Lord will forgive her because her father opposed her. Does it say that? No, it does not. It says in the Hebrew, if a woman makes a vow to the Lord or imposes a prohibition upon herself while in her father's house in her youth, if, in line 5, if her father heard her vow or her prohibition, not her pledge, which she has prohibited upon herself, yet her father remains silent, all her vows shall stand. So it says nothing about disapproval. It says that he didn't say anything. And then it goes on to say, but if her father hinders her, im hini aviha ota, all her vows and her prohibitions that she imposed on herself shall not stand. The Lord will forgive her because her father hindered her. So literally in the Hebrew, it doesn't say, oh, he just disapproved of her, and so forget it. All her promises are over. He has to actively stop her, hinder her, block her. So in the Hebrew, it is a much more equal contest of wills between the young woman in her father's house and the father. He can't just disapprove of her, and then God thinks his disapproval is so important that God's like, okay, I forgive you because your dad disapproved of your choice. No, it doesn't say that. God is not siding with the dad's disapproval in this family context. In the original, the translators of the RSV just invented that. It doesn't say that. And if she's married to a husband while under her vows or any thoughtless utterance of her lips by which she has bound herself, and her husband hears of it and says nothing to her on the day that he hears it, then her vows shall stand, and her pledges by which she has bound herself shall stand. Well, so line 6 is also totally wrong in the Revised Standard Version. It's interesting. It's a different line. It's line 7 in the Hebrew. Here it says, Ve'im hayu teye ish. It's not if she's married. It's literally, and if it will be that she will be to a man. And they translate it, but if she is, quote, betrothed to a man, in brackets, with her vows upon her, or by an utterance of her lips, which she has imposed upon herself. Much more serious, much more respectful of this woman's vows. The Revised Standard Version, I'm just going to say it, in its misogyny, puts in there where it doesn't exist any thoughtless utterance of her lips. It doesn't say thoughtless. It doesn't say thoughtless. There's no thoughtless in the Hebrew. It doesn't say that. And it doesn't say, and her husband hears of it, like he's just wandering around and people are gossiping. In the Hebrew, it says, and her husband hears it. Okay, so they just put the thoughtless in there as if women are just annoying flibberty-gibbets who can't be trusted to make vows or put prohibitions on their own bodies and selves. It's so bad. And then they do it again on line 8. But this is a Revised Standard Version. But if on the day that her husband comes to hear of it, he expresses disapproval, then he shall make void her vow which was on her, and the thoughtless utterance of her lips by which she bound herself, and the Lord will forgive her. No, it doesn't say this. Holy cow, it does not say this. I'm going to read you line 8 in the Hebrew. Veshama isha, and if her man hears her, beyom sham'o, on the day that he hears, vehecherish la, and is silent to her, vekamu nidareha, then her vows shall stand, ve'esareha asher asra, and the prohibitions which she has prohibited upon on her spirit will stand. It doesn't say anything about his disapproval. No disapproval. No thoughtless utterances. No. It just says if she makes this vow and he doesn't say anything, then her vow shall stand. And then line 9 in the Hebrew, ve'im, and if, beyom shma isha, on the day that her husband hears her, literally her man hears her, yani ota, ve'hefer et nidra, if he hinders her on the day that he heard it, he has revoked the vow that she's taken on herself and the utterance which she has imposed upon herself, and the Lord will forgive her. So it doesn't say, there's no disapproval in line 9 in the Hebrew, but in line 9, they invented, actually they made it line 8, but if on the day that her husband comes to hear of it, again, like he's just gossiping in the street, no, he has to actively hear it in the Hebrew. He expresses disapproval. No, he's hindering her. He's like, no, I'm blocking this. And he's right there present in the Hebrew. But this is just like, oh, someone in town says your daughter really made a vow. And he's like, well, that's really embarrassing. I don't approve of that. That's what they've softened it to. Then he shall make void her vow which was on her, and the thoughtless utterance of her lips by which she bound herself, and the Lord will forgive her. So they put thoughtless in here and disapproval in here falsely twice, and just made women seem like they're idiots. And it doesn't say that. This is a very respectful passage of women about their vows. There is no thoughtless and no disapproval. All right. They just invented it. By any vow or widow of a divorced woman, anything by which she's bound herself shall stand against her. It doesn't say that. That's line 9. This is the worst translated chapter I've seen. Line 9 it's actually line 10 here, which is interesting. Veneged almana, and against, veneder almana, and the vow of a widow, ugrusha, and a divorced woman, kol asher asra, everything which she prohibited, al nafsha, on her spirit, yakum aleha, will literally stand on her, will remain on her. The misogynist Revised Standard Version says, shall stand against her. Any vow of a widow or a divorced woman, anything by which she's bound herself, shall stand against her. That's how they translate it. They're saying women who are divorced or widows have no rights to bind themselves. It doesn't say that. And it doesn't say shall stand against her. It says they'll stand. They've literally inverted the meaning. In the Hebrew, it says any vow she makes, if she's a widow or divorced woman, because there is no man to, hinder her, that'll stand. She has to stick to it. It binds her because she's a serious person. In the English modern translation, it says all her vows suck and are eradicated. Everything that she vows shall stand against her, literally making up the invalidation of her vows. Then all her vows shall stand. But if her husband makes them null and void on the day he hears them, then whatever proceeds out of her lips concerning her vows or concerning her pledge of herself shall not stand. Her husband has made them void, and the Lord will forgive her. That's line 12. Let's see what it is in the Hebrew. Ve'im hafer yafer otam. He has to revoke them in the Hebrew. And in the English, it's makes them null and void, as if he is the law, as if he is God's law. And then they go on to say, any vow and any binding oath to afflict herself, her husband may establish, or her husband may make void. No! Oh my God, this gives total power to the man. Let's go back to line 13, which here is line 14. Kol neder, every vow, v'chol shvu'at, and every oath, isar le'onat nefesh, a binding oath of, and you've run into this word ani before. It means humble, or it does mean affliction or poor. It's the same word that Jesus used according to the Hebrew Matthew when he was saying blessed are the poor, but it's like to humble your spirit. Okay, so every binding oath of self-humbling, isha, her husband, yakimenu ve'isha yeferenu. Her husband will uphold it or revoke it. But the next line says, ve'im hacheresh yecharish, if her husband remains silent, and it intensifies it twice, La isha miyom el yom, and her husband remained silent from day to day. Vehikim et kol nidareha, all her vows and prohibitions she's assumed, he's upheld them. O et kol asareha asher aleha, all the prohibitions that are on her, hikim otam ki hecheresh la biyom shim'o. He has upheld them since he remained silent on the day that he heard it. So in the Hebrew, literally, the next line is, but if her husband says nothing to her from day to day, then he establishes all her vows or all her pledges that are upon her. He has established them because he said nothing to her on the day that he heard of them. So in English, it gives him the power to establish them, whereas in the Hebrew, it's they stand on her. But if he makes them null and void after he has heard of them, then he shall bear her iniquity. What is that line in the Hebrew? In the Hebrew, it's, but if he revokes them after having heard them, he shall bear her iniquity. And then it says in Hebrew, these are the statutes which the Lord commanded Moshe concerning a man and his wife, a father and his daughter in her youth while in her father's house. What did they do? In the Revised Standard Version, these are the statutes which the Lord commanded Moshe as between a man and his wife and between a father and his daughter while in her youth within her father's house. As between a man and his wife and between a father and his daughter while in her youth within her father's house. So that's it. But I guess the last few lines remain reasonably translated in the Revised Standard Version, but the complete inversion of the woman's right to limited right, but clear right, and in the case of a widow and a divorced woman, complete right to dispose of her own person or swear an oath. The Revised Standard Version falsely upends and weakens those rights, which the Hebrew clearly assign to women, and in varying degrees, depending on whether there's a man in the house, whether the man speaks up in time, actively hinders her. Again, to recap, the Revised Standard Version puts thoughtless utterance into the swearing of women where it does not exist. In the Hebrew, doesn't exist. And in fact, the implication, the language is the opposite in the Hebrew. These are swear oaths and prohibitions that are repeated very seriously using that intensifying verb. And really, the oaths and prohibitions language is in Yom Kippur also, like Kol Nidre, every oath, Kol Nidre. It's a famous section of the Yom Kippur service. Ve'esarei, same language, every oath, every commitment that we've made. So these are very profound words, and they remain profound in the liturgy. But the Revised Standard Version is like, oh, that flibberty gibbet, she didn't have a thought in her pretty little head. She's made an oath. I disapprove of it. I'm a man, so it's null and void. Doesn't say that. And the disapproval totally doesn't say that. He has to hinder her, block her, stop her, like two equals, having an active argument in the house, hinder her like she's going to sign the papers and he stands in her way, kind of hinder her. So it's not disapproval. It has to be on the same day. He has to hear of it in the house. In the Revised Standard Version, he can, hear of it anywhere. And it's shameful. It's absolutely shameful. They undo women's authority as civil authorities in relation to other people in their society to make commitments and to be bound by oaths, but they also undo women's rights to create prohibitions and restrictions on their own spirits and souls and selves. And it shame of all the mistranslations I've read. This is the worst chapter in the Revised Standard Version. Again, my door is always open to the publishers of the Revised Standard Version to come tell me I'm wrong, show me I'm wrong. I'm right in the Hebrew. Everything I've told you is true. It's a horrible, sexist mistranslation, bad faith, distortion of what the Hebrew says in a way that I would not be surprised if it had the effect of turning a lot of women away from the Bible. Because what a way to treat women. What a way for God to treat women. Oh, you're a thoughtless twit. Nothing you say makes a difference. Your husband has the right to disapprove of any commitment you made and make it null and void. I would stop reading at that point. If that's what I thought God had arranged, I would be like, this is not for me. This is not a God that I understand or that understands me. So that's my riff today. On a happier note, the Hebrew, if you're a woman or a man, I hope it makes you feel very profoundly taken seriously by God. Your word matters, whether you're a man or a woman, whoever you are, your word matters. And I think that's the takeaway on a more positive note, because it means everyone's important. Everyone's, equally valuable. Everyone gets a say, free will, gets self-determination. And, to say it 3,200 years ago, women had the right to put prohibitions on their spirit, on their selves, is a very radically respectful thing to say about women if you're God, or if you're Moshe, or if you're Moshe speaking for God in a very patriarchal context. So that's my read of Numbers 30. We have, again, lost two of our sponsors. We appreciated them. We loved having them. Things move on. I respect that. But it really does mean if you are getting value out of these readings or the other work that I do at Outspoken, on Substack, or over on Daily Clout, our tools to pass any state or federal bill from your phone, to share bills socially, to stop bad bills, to start good bills. All of this work, really requires resources. And if you are getting value out of these readings, please support them. We literally have thousands of followers now for the Geneva Bible, but only 79 paid subscribers. And if you can afford that $7 a month to support the effort, I really ask you to do it. We really can't keep our doors open now without making up the shortfall. And that's like within the next month, seriously. So please help. And if you can, and if you can't, just share, and let's keep going. And tonight is the second night of Passover. Have a wonderful Passover. If you're celebrating Passover, if you're not actively celebrating Passover, we can all still celebrate together, being free and not enslaved, and remembering that, our world really requires freedom for everyone. Thank you so much. Love you guys. I will see you tomorrow, I trust. Take care. Bye.